The rich woman, named Mrs. Smith, had always had a comfortable life. She lived in a grand mansion with her husband, John, and their 2 children. However, her life took an unexpected turn when she decided to bring a mad woman's baby into their home. The baby's mother, a woman named Sarah, had been living on the streets. She was known to be unstable and had a reputation for being crazy. One day, Mrs. Smith encountered Sarah and her baby, Emily, on the street. Feeling sorry for them, Mrs. Smith decided to take Emily in and raise her as her own. As soon as Emily entered the Smiths' household, strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, and objects would move around the house. Some people in the town started to whisper that Emily was cursed, and that Sarah's madness had been passed down to her daughter. Despite the rumors, Mrs. Smith was determined to give Emily a loving home. She hired a nanny to take care of Emily and made sure she had everything she needed. However, as time passed, Emily started to exhibit strange behavior. She would talk to herself, and sometimes she would even laugh or cry for no reason. John, Mrs. Smith's husband, was not pleased with the situation. He felt that Emily was a disruption to their peaceful life, and he worried about the impact she would have on their children. He started to argue with Mrs. Smith, saying that they had made a mistake by bringing Emily into their home. As the tension in the household grew, Mrs. Smith started to wonder if she had made a mistake. Was Emily truly cursed, or was there something more sinister at play? As the days went by, the strange occurrences in the Smiths' household continued to escalate. Doors would slam shut on their own, and objects would move around the house. Some nights, Mrs. Smith would wake up to the sound of whispers in the hallway, but whenever she went to investigate, there would be no one there. The nanny, Mrs. Jenkins, was also experiencing strange things. She would find Emily's toys and clothes scattered all over the room, even though she had just cleaned up. And sometimes, when she was putting Emily to bed, she would feel an icy breeze in the room, even though the windows were closed. Mrs. Smith's children, James and Elizabeth, were also starting to feel the effects of the strange happenings. They would hear footsteps in the night, and sometimes they would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Mrs. Smith was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She started to research the history of the house, thinking that maybe there was a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. But the more she dug, the more she realized that the house had a dark past. The house had been built on an old cemetery, and many people in the town believed that it was haunted by the spirits of the dead. Mrs. Smith didn't believe in ghosts, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. One night, Mrs. Smith decided to set up a camera in the hallway to catch evidence of the strange happenings. She waited anxiously for the next morning to review the footage. And what she saw shocked her to the core. The camera had captured a figure lurking in the hallway, a figure that looked eerily like Sarah, Emily's mother. But that wasn't possible. Sarah was still living on the streets, and there was no way she could have been in the house. Mrs. Smith was torn between fear and curiosity. She didn't know what to make of the footage, but she was determined to uncover the truth. She decided to pay Sarah a visit, to see if she could shed some light on the mysterious happenings. As Mrs. Smith approached Sarah's makeshift home, she felt a sense of trepidation. What would she find? And what would Sarah tell her? As Mrs. Smith approached Sarah's makeshift home, a small tent on the outskirts of town, she felt a sense of trepidation. She had never been to this part of town before, and the sight of the tent and the surrounding trash-filled area made her uncomfortable. She took a deep breath and called out to Sarah, Sarah, it's me, Mrs. Smith. I need to talk to you." Sarah emerged from the tent, looking disheveled and confused. "Oh, Mrs. Smith. What are you doing here?" Mrs. Smith hesitated for a moment before asking, Sarah, I need to ask you something. Have you been to my house lately?" Sarah looked at her with a mixture of fear and defiance. No, I haven't. Why would I go to your house? Mrs. Smith showed her the footage from the camera. This was taken in my hallway last night. It looks like you. Can you explain it to me? Sarah's expression changed from fear to shock. That's not me, as she said, her voice shaking. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Smith wasn't convinced. She had seen the footage, and it looked like Sarah. But Sarah's reaction seemed genuine. Maybe there was something more to this than met the eye. Sarah, I need to ask you something else, Mrs. Smith said, her voice softer. What's going on with Emily? She's been acting strange, and I've been getting these strange feelings in the house. Is there something you're not telling me? Sarah looked around nervously, as if she was afraid of being overheard. I don't know what you're talking about, as she repeated. But I'll tell you this, Mrs. Smith. You shouldn't have taken Emily in. She's not like other children. She's special. Mrs. Smith felt a chill run down her spine. What did Sarah mean? And what was so special about Emily? Suddenly, Sarah's expression changed again. She looked at Mrs. Smith with a fierce determination. You need to get Emily out of that house, as she said. It's not safe for her. And it's not safe for you either. Mrs. Smith was taken aback. What was going on? And why was Sarah so insistent that Emily leave the house? Mrs. Smith's curiosity was piqued. She wanted to know more about Emily and the house. What do you mean, Sarah? She asked. What's special about Emily, and why isn't it safe for her in the house? Sarah hesitated, looking around nervously again. I shouldn't be telling you this, she said. But I have to. Emily, she's not just any child. She has a gift. A special gift that makes her different. Mrs. Smith's eyes widened. What kind of gift? She asked. Sarah leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily can see things. Things that other people can't. She can see spirits and ghosts and other things. Things that are hidden from us. Mrs. Smith felt a shiver run down her spine. She had always suspected that Emily was a special child, but she had no idea that she had a gift like this. What does this have to do with the house? She asked. Sarah's expression turned grim. The house. It's not just any house. It's a place of power. A place where the veil between the worlds is thin. And Emily, she's a key part of it. She's the one who can unlock the secrets of the house. Mrs. Smith's mind was reeling. She had so many questions, but before she could ask any of them, Sarah stood up and started to walk away. Wait, Mrs. Smith called out. Where are you going? You can't just leave me with all these questions. Sarah turned back, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intensity. I've told you enough, she said. Now it's up to you to figure out the rest. But be warned, Mrs. Smith, the house is not what it seems. And Emily, she's in grave danger. With that, Sarah turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Mrs. Smith with more questions than answers. As Mrs. Smith walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. She had uncovered a secret about Emily, but she had a feeling that there was much more to the story. When she got home, she decided to do some research on the house and its history. She spent hours poring over old books and documents, looking for any mention of the house or its previous occupants. And then, just as she was about to give up, she stumbled upon an old diary that belonged to one of the house's former owners. As she began to read, she discovered a dark and sinister secret about the house, a secret that made her blood run cold. As Mrs. Smith read on, she discovered that the diary belonged to a woman named Elizabeth, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Elizabeth's writings were cryptic and often disturbing, but they seemed to hint at a dark presence that lurked within the house. One entry in particular caught Mrs. Smith's attention. "I have seen it again, the shadow in the hallway. It moves of its own accord, and I can feel its eyes upon me. I have tried to tell my husband, but he thinks I am mad. I fear that I am not alone in this house, and that something evil is stirring." Mrs. Smith felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth was writing about the same strange occurrences that she had experienced in the house. As she continued to read, Mrs. Smith came across another entry that made her blood run cold. "I have discovered the truth about this house. It was built on an ancient burial ground, and the spirits of the dead are restless. They are trapped between worlds, and they are angry. I fear that I have unleashed a terrible evil by living in this house, and that it will consume us all." Mrs. Smith couldn't believe what she was reading. She had always known that the house had a dark history, but she had no idea that it was built on an ancient burial ground. She felt a sense of dread wash over her, and she knew that she had to get to the bottom of the mystery. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Smith with an unnerving intensity. "Emily, what are you doing up?" Mrs. Smith asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she walked towards Mrs. Smith, her eyes fixed on the diary in her hand. "Emily, what's wrong?" Mrs. Smith asked, feeling a sense of unease. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Emily spoke. "The house is alive. And it's hungry." Mrs. Smith felt a chill run down her spine. What did Emily mean? And what was happening in the house? Mrs. Smith's heart was racing as she looked at Emily. She had never seen her act like this before, and she was starting to get scared. "Emily, what do you mean?" Mrs. Smith asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean the house is alive and hungry?" Emily's eyes seemed to glaze over, and she started to speak in a monotone voice. "The house is a living thing," she said. "It has a spirit, a consciousness. And it's hungry for energy, for life force. It's been feeding on us, on our emotions, our fears, our happiness. But it's not enough. It wants more." Mrs. Smith was horrified. She had never heard of anything like this before, and she didn't know what to make of it. "Emily, how do you know this?" Mrs. Smith asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Emily's eyes snapped back into focus, and she looked at Mrs. Smith with a serious expression. "I can feel it," as she said. "I can feel the house's energy, its pulse. It's like a heartbeat, but it's not a living thing. It's something else, something ancient and evil." Mrs. Smith was starting to get really scared. She didn't know what to do or how to protect Emily and her family from this thing. "Emily, we need to get out of here," Mrs. Smith said, trying to grab Emily's hand. "We need to leave this house and never come back." But Emily resisted. She pulled her hand away and looked at Mrs. Smith with a determined expression. "No," she said. "We can't leave. We have to face it, to confront it. We have to make it stop." Mrs. Smith was taken aback. She had never seen Emily like this before, so determined and brave. "Emily, I don't know if that's a good idea," Mrs. Smith said, trying to reason with her. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. We could be putting ourselves in danger." But Emily was resolute. She stood up straight and looked at Mrs. Smith with a fierce expression. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm not afraid of the house, or its spirit, or whatever it is. I'm going to face it, and I'm going to make it stop. Mrs. Smith was torn. Part of her wanted to protect Emily and get her out of there, but another part of her was proud of Emily's bravery and determination. Mrs. Smith took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, Emily. If you're sure you want to do this, I'll support you. But we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Emily nodded, a determined look on her face. I know what I'm doing, Mrs. Smith. I've been feeling this energy for a while now, and I think I can communicate with it. Mrs. Smith wasn't sure if she believed Emily, but she was willing to try anything to help her. Okay, let's do it. But if anything feels off or scary, we're getting out of here, okay? Emily nodded, and together they walked to the center of the house. The air seemed to grow colder as they moved, and Mrs. Smith could feel a strange, pulsating energy emanating from the walls. Emily, what's going on? Mrs. Smith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm calling to it, Emily replied, her eyes closed. I'm trying to connect with the energy. Suddenly, the lights in the house began to flicker, and a low, rumbling noise filled the air. Mrs. Smith felt a surge of fear, but Emily seemed calm, her eyes still closed. It's here, Emily said, her voice steady. It's responding to me. The noise grew louder, and the lights began to strobe wildly. Mrs. Smith felt like she was being pulled towards something, but she didn't know what. Emily, what's happening? Mrs. Smith cried, her voice lost in the din. But Emily didn't respond. She was too busy communicating with the energy, trying to understand what it wanted. As the noise reached a fever pitch, Mrs. Smith felt like she was being torn apart. She was scared, but she was also fascinated. What was this energy, and what did it want with them? Suddenly, the noise stopped, and the lights went out. Mrs. Smith was plunged into darkness, and she felt like she was floating in midair. When the lights flickered back on, Mrs. Smith saw Emily standing in front of her, a look of shock on her face. What happened? Mrs. Smith asked, her voice shaking. Emily turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. It's not just a house, she said. It's a portal. A portal to another dimension. Mrs. Smith's mind reeled as she tried to process what Emily was saying. A portal to another dimension? What did that even mean? But before she could ask any questions, Emily spoke again. And we're not alone. There's something on the other side, watching us. Waiting for us. Mrs. Smith felt a chill run down her spine. What was on the other side of the portal, and it want with them? Mrs. Smith's heart was racing as she looked at Emily. What do you mean, something is watching us? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Emily's eyes were wide with fear. I don't know, she said. But I can feel it. It's like something is waiting for us on the other side of the portal. Mrs. Smith took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew she had to try and communicate with the entity on the other side of the portal. Emily, can you try and communicate with it? Mrs. Smith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her eyes closed. I'll try, she said. As Emily concentrated, the air in the room began to charge with an electric tension. Mrs. Smith could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as Emily began to speak in a low, hypnotic voice. We mean you no harm, Emily said. We're just trying to understand what's going on. There was a pause, and then Emily spoke again. I'm getting something, she said. It's a message. Mrs. Smith leaned forward, her heart racing with anticipation. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes snapped open, and she looked at Mrs. Smith with a shocked expression. It's a warning, she said. It's telling us to get out of the house. Now. Mrs. Smith's heart skipped a beat. What did the entity mean? And why was it warning them to leave the house? Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker wildly, and the air was filled with an eerie, pulsating energy. I think it's trying to tell us something, Emily said, her voice trembling with fear. Mrs. Smith nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. We need to get out of here, she said. Now. As they turned to leave, Mrs. Smith heard a faint whispering in her ear. You shouldn't have come here, the voice said. Now you'll never leave. Mrs. Smith spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from all around her, echoing off the walls. What was that? Emily asked, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Smith shook her head. I don't know, she said. But I think we're in grave danger. As they stumbled out of the room, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. You'll never leave, it said. You'll never escape. Mrs. Smith and Emily ran as fast as they could, but the voice seemed to be following them, echoing off the walls. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for air in the cool night breeze. As they looked back at the house, Mrs. Smith saw something that made her blood run cold. The windows were glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. And then, in a flash of insight, Mrs. Smith understood the true horror of their situation. The house was not just a portal to another dimension. It was a prison. And they were the captives. Mrs. Smith and Emily stood outside the house, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened. They had been warned to leave, but they had no idea what was going on or how to escape the house's influence. We need to get out of here, Mrs. Smith said, her voice shaking with fear. We need to find a way to break the house's hold on us. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. But how? She asked. We don't even know what's going on. Mrs. Smith thought for a moment. She remembered the research she had done on the house's history, and she wondered if there was a connection between the house and the strange occurrences. I think I might have an idea, Mrs. Smith said. Let's go to the library and see if we can find any information about the house's past. Maybe there's a way to break the curse or whatever it is that's affecting us. Emily nodded, and they set off towards the library. As they walked, Mrs. Smith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following them. When they arrived at the library, Mrs. Smith began to search through old books and records, looking for any mention of the house or its history. Emily sat down at a table, looking through some old newspapers and magazines. After a few hours of searching, Mrs. Smith finally found something. It was an old diary belonging to a former owner of the house, and it described a ritual that had been performed to try and rid the house of its dark energy. Mrs. Smith's eyes widened as she read the diary. She realized that the ritual might be the key to breaking the house's hold on them. Emily, I think I found something, Mrs. Smith said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked up from her reading, her eyes wide with excitement. What is it? She asked. Mrs. Smith showed her the diary, and Emily's eyes scanned the pages. As she read, her expression changed from excitement to fear. This is it, Emily said. This is the way to break the curse. But it's not going to be easy. Mrs. Smith nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. I know, she said. But we have to try. We can't just sit back and let the house control us. Emily nodded, and together they began to make plans to perform the ritual. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to break the house's hold on them and escape its influence once and for all. As they left the library, Mrs. Smith felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in days. They might actually be able to escape the house's influence and start a new life, free from its dark energy. But as they walked, Mrs. Smith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following them. And then, just as they were turning the corner onto their street, Mrs. Smith saw something that made her blood run cold. The house was waiting for them, its windows glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Mrs. Smith and Emily stood outside the house, looking up at its glowing windows. They knew they had to act fast before the house's influence became too strong. "Okay, let's do this," Mrs. Smith said, her voice firm. "We'll perform the ritual and break the curse." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with determination. "I'm ready," she said. They walked into the house, feeling the familiar chill run down their spines. But this time, they were prepared. They had the diary, and they knew what to do. The ritual required them to gather certain items, including candles, herbs, and a small crystal. They had found all of these things in the library, and now they were ready to use them. As they began the ritual, the air in the house seemed to grow colder. The windows glowed brighter, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. But Mrs. Smith and Emily didn't let this intimidate them. They stood firm, reciting the words of the ritual and performing the actions described in the diary. As they reached the climax of the ritual, the house seemed to shudder and tremble. The windows flashed brightly, and then went dark. The air was silent, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing. And then, slowly, the house began to change. The shadows receded, and the air grew warmer. The windows, once glowing with an otherworldly light, now seemed normal and mundane. Mrs. Smith and Emily looked at each other, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. "We did it," Mrs. Smith whispered. "We broke the curse." Emily nodded, a small smile on her face. "We're free," she said. But as they turned to leave the house, they heard a faint whispering in their ears. "You may have broken the curse," the voice said, "but you'll never be free from the house's influence. It will always be a part of you, haunting you, watching you." Mrs. Smith and Emily spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the walls. They looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. "What does it mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Smith shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "But I think we're about to find out." As they walked out of the house, they felt a strange sensation, as if they were being pulled back into the house's influence. And then, everything went black. When Mrs. Smith came to, she was lying in her bed, feeling groggy and disoriented. Emily was sitting next to her, holding her hand. "What happened?" Mrs. Smith asked, her voice weak. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "You've been asleep for a long time," she said. "But I've been watching over you. And I think I know what's going on." Mrs. Smith sat up, her heart racing with anticipation. "What is it?" she asked. Emily leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "The house may be gone, but its influence remains. And I think it's inside us, watching us, waiting for us to make our next move." Mrs. Smith's eyes widened in horror as she realized the truth. They may have broken the curse, but they were far from free. Mrs. Smith and Emily knew they had to act fast. They couldn't just sit back and let the house's influence control them. They decided to seek out the help of a local expert, a paranormal investigator who had experience with cases like theirs. The investigator, A kind and knowledgeable woman named Dr. Lee listened to their story and nodded sympathetically. "I believe you," she said, "and I think I can help you." Dr. Lee explained that the house's influence was likely a form of psychic imprinting, where the energy of the house had imprinted itself on their minds. She said that it was possible to remove the imprint, but it would require a special ritual and some specialized equipment. Mrs. Smith and Emily were willing to try anything, and they agreed to let Dr. Lee perform the ritual. They spent the next few days gathering the necessary materials and preparing themselves for the ritual. Finally, the day of the ritual arrived. Dr. Lee led them to a quiet, secluded spot in the woods, where she had set up a small altar and some equipment. She explained that the ritual would involve a form of meditation, where they would focus their minds and try to connect with the energy of the house. As they began the ritual, Mrs. Smith and Emily felt a strange sensation, as if they were being pulled back into the house. But Dr. Lee reassured them, telling them that this was a normal part of the process. The ritual lasted for several hours, during which time Mrs. Smith and Emily felt themselves becoming more and more relaxed. They began to feel a sense of detachment from the house, as if they were finally breaking free from its influence. When the ritual was finished, Dr. Lee smiled and nodded. "It's done," she said. "The imprint has been removed. You're free." Mrs. Smith and Emily looked at each other, feeling a sense of relief and joy. They knew that they still had a long way to go, but they were finally on the path to recovery. As they walked back to their car, Mrs. Smith turned to Emily and smiled. "We did it," she said. "We're finally free." Emily smiled back, her eyes shining with tears. "We sure are," she said. But as they drove away from the woods, Mrs. Smith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She looked in the rearview mirror, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the radio turned on, blasting a loud, static-filled signal. Mrs. Smith jumped, her heart racing. And then, a voice spoke, its words echoing through the speakers. "You may have removed the imprint," it said, "but you'll never be free from the house's influence. It will always be a part of you, haunting you, watching you." Mrs. Smith's eyes widened in horror as she realized that the house's influence was still with them, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next move. Mrs. Smith and Emily were determined to get rid of the house's influence once and for all. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to try anything. They started by researching ways to destroy psychic imprints and negative energy. They read books, articles, and online forums, looking for any information that might help them. One night, while browsing through a forum, Mrs. Smith stumbled upon a post from a user who claimed to have experience with destroying negative energy. The user recommended a ritual that involved burning sage, sweetgrass, and other herbs to purify the air and drive out negative energy. Mrs. Smith and Emily decided to give it a try. They gathered the necessary herbs and set up a small altar in their living room. They lit the herbs and let the smoke fill the air, hoping to purify their surroundings and drive out the house's influence. As they sat in the smoke-filled room, they felt a strange sensation, like the air was being cleared of a heavy burden. They began to feel lighter, freer, and more at peace. But just as they were starting to feel hopeful, the lights in the room began to flicker and the air grew cold. The house's influence was fighting back, trying to maintain its hold on them. Mrs. Smith and Emily knew they had to do more. They decided to seek out the help of a powerful psychic who specialized in destroying negative energy. They found a woman named Ava who claimed to have the ability to destroy psychic imprints and negative energy. Ava was a tall, imposing figure with a kind face and a warm smile. She listened to their story and nodded sympathetically. "I can help you," she said. "But it won't be easy. The house's influence is strong, and it will fight back. Are you prepared to face what's coming?" Mrs. Smith and Emily nodded, determined to finally be free of the house's influence. Ava smiled and began to prepare for the ritual. She lit candles, burned incense, and chanted ancient words. The air in the room began to vibrate with energy, and Mrs. Smith and Emily felt themselves being lifted out of their bodies. They saw visions of the house, its dark history, and the evil that had been done within its walls. They saw the faces of the people who had lived and died there, their spirits trapped by the house's influence. As they watched, Ava began to chant louder, her voice rising to a crescendo. The energy in the room built to a fever pitch, and Mrs. Smith and Emily felt themselves being pulled towards the house. They were back in the house, standing in the foyer. But this time, they were not alone. Ava was with them, her eyes blazing with a fierce inner light. "We're going to destroy the house's influence once and for all," Ava said, her voice firm. "Are you ready?" Mrs. Smith and Emily nodded, their hearts pounding with excitement and fear. Ava raised her hands, and a blast of energy shot out, filling the room with a bright, pulsating light. Mrs. Smith and Emily felt themselves being lifted off the ground, suspended in midair by the energy. The house's influence was fighting back, trying to maintain its hold on them. But Ava was powerful, and her energy was overwhelming. The house's influence began to falter, its grip on Mrs. Smith and Emily weakening. As the energy reached its peak, Ava spoke a single word, a release. The energy exploded, filling the room with a blinding light. Mrs. Smith and Emily felt themselves being propelled forward, free from the house's influence. When the light faded, they found themselves back in Ava's office, sitting in chairs and feeling a sense of peace and freedom they had not known in months. Ava smiled, her eyes shining with satisfaction. "It's done," she said. "The house's influence is destroyed. You're free." Mrs. Smith and Emily looked at each other, tears of joy streaming down their faces. They hugged each other, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. As they pulled back, Mrs. Smith turned to Ava. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for saving us." Ava smiled and nodded. "You're welcome," she said. "But remember, the house's influence may be gone, but its memory will linger. Be careful, and don't let its darkness consume you." Mrs. Smith and Emily nodded, knowing that they would always carry the scars of their experience with them. But they also knew that they were free, and that they could finally start to rebuild their lives. As they left Ava's office, they felt a sense of hope and renewal. They knew that they would face challenges in the future, but they were ready. They were free, and they were strong. And as they walked away from the office, they felt the sun on their faces, warm and bright. They knew that they would always carry the memory of the house with them, but they also knew that they would never be trapped by its influence again.